conflict in Ukraine has negatively changed the world in less than a week. Russia's invasion of Ukraine carries huge risks for a world economy that's yet to fully recover from the pandemic shock and could fundamentally reshape the global economy by slowing growth and jacking up inflation. Before the war started, the Russian economy was the 11th biggest in the world, according to International Monetary Fund data. It was a key supplier in the area of commodities, particularly energy and food. As Ukraine fights for survival, Western governments are taking steps to punish Russia. As quick fire, the Russian economy has been pummeled by Western unprecedented sanctions.
We are enforcing the most significant package of economic sanctions in history, and it's causing significant damage to Russia's economy.
The Western government has implemented a series of sanctions to isolate Russia from the global financial system and weaken its military edge. The most significant to date are the unprecedented penalties on Russia's central bank. The Western government have effectively frozen the bank's foreign assets, preventing it from using its foreign reserves to prop up the value of the Russian ruble, and blacklisted a major Russian sovereign wealth fund, further restricting Moscow's access to money from abroad.
I will now propose to EU leaders the following measures. First, we commit to ensuring that a certain number of Russian banks are removed from SWIFT. Cutting banks off will stop them from conducting most of their financial transactions worldwide and effectively block Russian exports and imports.
The U.S. has placed Russia's top 10 financial institutions, representing about 80% of the country's banking sector, under restrictions. Visa and MasterCard have blocked the sanctioned Russian financial institutions from their payment networks. Sanctions have been imposed on 7 Russian wealthy business leaders known as oligarchs, who are considered close to the Russia government, and 386 members of Russian parliament. Assets belonging to Russian President Vladimir Putin and his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, are being frozen in the US, EU, UK and Canada. The West has also introduced a ban on exports of aircraft and aviation parts to Russia, as well as exports of high-tech goods including semiconductors, computers, telecoms and information security equipment and sensors. UK and EU-based companies are also banned from exporting to a wide range of Russian defense, naval, transport and communications companies. These sanctions will seriously impact the technological level of the Russian economy. Many military products will be impossible to produce in Russia if sanctions remain in place. The severity of these sanctions is amplified by the boycott of Russia by global companies that do not want to take political risks. BP and Shell are withdrawing from oil and gas projects in Russia. Car companies, such as Ford, Volvo, Jaguar, Hyundai, BMW and Toyota, have announced they will stop production or stop supplying cars to Russia. The world's biggest shipping lines, MSC and Maersk, suspended container shipping to and from Russia. Banks have stopped lending to traders to buy Russian oil, and insurance companies are sharply increasing their rates for transporting it by sea. McDonald's is temporarily closing its roughly 850 restaurants in Russia. Starbucks also closing its 100 coffee shops. Pepsi will no longer be sold in Russia. Airplane giants Boeing and Airbus have both stopped supplying parts and support to Russian airlines. Visa, MasterCard, American Express, Apple and Google Pay limit their services in Russia. The US is banning all Russian oil and gas imports, and the UK will phase out Russian oil by the end of 2022. The EU, which gets a quarter of its oil and 40% of its gas from Russia, says it will switch to alternative supplies and make Europe independent from Russian energy well before 2030. Germany has put on hold permission for the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline from Russia to open. Nord Stream 2 is a 1,200 km pipeline under the Baltic Sea, which will take gas from the Russian coast near St. Petersburg to Lubmin in Germany. It cost $11 billion and was completed in September 2021. Nord Stream 2 runs parallel to an existing gas pipeline, Nord Stream, which has been working since 2011. Together, these two pipelines could deliver 110 billion cubic meters of gas to Europe every year. That is over a quarter of all the gas that EU countries use annually. The pipeline does not yet have an operating license, and Germany has now put this on hold. Energy exports are a vital source of revenue for Russia, but the move is also likely to impact Western consumers. The invasion of Ukraine has placed Russia on the verge of bankruptcy. Interest rates have doubled, the stock market has closed, and the ruble has fallen to its lowest level ever. The military costs of war have been exacerbated by an unprecedented level of international sanctions, sustained by a large coalition of countries. Russian citizens, now unable to spend at IKEA, McDonald's, or Starbucks, are not allowed to convert any of the money they do have into foreign currency. Generous estimates suggest the Russian economy could shrink by 7% next year, instead of the 2% growth that was forecast before the invasion. Others say the drop could be as much as 15%. Long-term perspectives are dire. If sanctions are maintained, Russia will be cut off from its main trading partners apart from China and Belarus. Rating agencies now predict Russia will soon be unable to pay back its creditors, again with colossal long-term impacts on the economy. Its reputation as a disreputable borrower will make it hard to attract foreign investments without massive guarantees, potentially making it entirely dependent on China. The economic scenario actually looks even worse if Putin reaches a point where he claims victory in Ukraine. Occupying the country and installing a puppet government would surely involve taking responsibility for rebuilding destroyed infrastructure. And with Ukrainian citizens increasingly pro-European, maintaining peace in such a hostile environment would force Putin to divert a huge amount of resources from the Russian budget. It's not just military hardware that costs money. There are estimates that as many as 12,000 Russian soldiers have been killed. International Monetary Fund estimate the Ukrainian economy could shrink by more than a third this year if the war with Russia continues. The country is already facing a downturn of 10% due to the invasion, which has hit major cities, destroyed airports, and precipitated a refugee crisis. A deep recession and large reconstruction costs are to be expected on the backdrop of a humanitarian crisis. Kirilo Shevchenko, governor of the National Bank of Ukraine, said that Russia should eventually be made to pay to repair the damage caused during the invasion. Frozen Russian assets should be used to rebuild Ukraine after the war. Much of Russia's $630 billion of foreign exchange reserves are thought to be held outside the country, and effectively frozen by sanctions in the US, the EU, and other places. That would make billions available for reconstruction, if Ukraine is able to access it once the war is over. In the space of 1 week, some of the old certainties about Europe have been thrown out the window. Most spectacularly, Germany, whose Nazi past has seen it avoid becoming a significant military power, has now committed itself to dramatically increasing its military spending.
Aber der Krieg wird sich auch als Katastrophe für Russland erweisen. Von nun an, Jahr für Jahr, mehr als 2% des Bruttoinlandsprodukts in unsere Verteidigung.
Even Switzerland, whose neutrality has lasted since the Napoleonic Wars, has suddenly joined the EU's economic sanctions targeting Russian banks and assets. Oil and natural gas prices soared after another round of Western sanctions on Russia as traders braced for supply disruptions from Russia, one of the world's largest oil and gas exporters, and Ukraine, a major transit country for Russian gas. In fact, oil and gas prices are spiked even before Western has formally sanctioned Russian energy. This is because energy traders are mostly avoiding Russian oil, to avoid being tainted by scandal. In the UK, port workers have refused to unload shipments of Russian oil in protest over the Ukraine invasion. In the US, lawmakers at a city council moved to suspend the operating licenses of Lukoil-branded gas stations. Meanwhile, online, the oil giant Shell was forced to justify why it bought Russian oil. Russia is the third biggest producer of oil in the world, behind the US and Saudi Arabia. Of about 5 million barrels of crude oil it exports each day, more than half of that goes to Europe. Russian imports account for 8% of total UK oil demand. The US is less reliant, with about 3% of its imported oil coming from Russia in 2020. Russian gas accounts for about 40% of the EU's natural gas imports. If this dried up, Italy and Germany would be especially vulnerable. It is hard to find substitute. Any disruption in gas supply could leave Europeans without enough gas to heat their homes and with exorbitant electricity bills as utilities would be left scrambling for the fuel to generate power. Ukraine and Russia are both global breadbaskets. The crisis has also ramped up fears about supplies of grains such as wheat and corn and oilseeds. Russia and Ukraine together account for about 30% of global wheat exports, nearly a fifth of the corn trade, and about 80% of sunflower oil exports. Both are key suppliers of wheat to the Middle East and North Africa. It's estimated that Lebanon and Libya import about 40% of their wheat from Russia and Ukraine, Yemen around 20%, and Egypt around 80%. Therefore, any disruption of wheat supplies would heavily affect the Middle East, with shortages and price hikes. Ukraine exports 95% of its grain through the Black Sea. Now, the Black Sea is a no-go zone for commercial shipping because some vessels have been hit by missiles and Russia is menacing Ukrainian ports. Supplies of agricultural fertilizer may decrease around the world, as Russia and its ally Belarus control more than a third of the world's potash production, a key ingredient in fertilizer. Russia alone controls 14% of nitrogen-based fertilizer. Reduced global availability could send prices for these nutrients higher and financially hobble farm belts across a slew of countries. Russia is also a major producer of several base metals such as aluminium, titanium, palladium and nickel, all of which will register price jumps. Prices will remain at peak levels as long as the conflict continues. This will have a substantial impact on industrial sectors, such as the automotive industry across the globe. Financial sanctions will have an impact on supply chains and trade, as companies will struggle to find financial channels through which to conduct trade with Russia. In addition, the possible destruction of some transport infrastructure, notably ports in Ukraine, will compound existing supply chain issues. Disruption to supply chains will come from three sources: difficulties affecting land-based routes, restrictions on air links, and the cancellation of sea freight routes from Ukraine. Land-based trade routes between Asia and Europe will be disrupted as transit through Russia becomes more difficult or impossible from a compliance, reputational, or safety perspective. Air ties between Russia and Europe, and, in turn, Asia and Europe will be severely hampered following the decision of EU countries to close their airspace to Russian aircraft and cargo, and Russia's reciprocal measure to close its own airspace to European planes. About 35% of global freight was being transported by air prior to the pandemic. Sea freight routes through the Black Sea will be cancelled for several weeks following Ukraine's decision to shut down commercial shipping and Turkey's move to restrict transit through the Bosphorus. This situation will have a notable impact on grain shipments transiting through Ukrainian, Russian, and possibly Bulgarian and Romanian ports. For most people around the world, the economic impact of the Ukrainian conflict and sanctions would be felt in the form of higher inflation caused mainly by higher energy, metal, and food prices. The invasion risks derailing global economic recovery from the pandemic, complicating matters for policymakers who are expected to tighten the money supply to contain inflation, which was hovering at decades high in countries such as the US and Germany even before the war.
As we respond, my administration is using every tool at our disposal to protect American businesses and consumers from rising prices at the pump. As I said last week, defending freedom will have cost. For us as well, and here at home.
The economic impact of the conflict will be felt mostly in Ukraine and Russia, which will both experience sharp recessions this year. Those Eastern European countries that are most exposed to trade with Russia, such as Lithuania and Latvia, will also take a hit from the conflict. Elsewhere in Europe, the EU will suffer from an energy, supply chain and trade shock. Beyond the suffering and humanitarian crisis from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the entire global economy will feel the effects of slower growth and faster inflation. While some effects may not fully come into focus for many years, there are already clear signs that the war and resulting jump in costs for essential commodities will make it harder for policymakers in some countries to strike the delicate balance between containing inflation and supporting the economic recovery from the pandemic.